Hello, Rob. Thank you so much for joining the Internal Communication Spotlight series that I run on my blog. As you know, there's a series which I talk to thought leaders on various aspects of internal communications. It's been long running, and I've really value your time and your insights on this very interesting topic of internal communications governance. So before we get started, it'll be great if you could quickly introduce yourself for our viewers.
Okay, we are Russell-Olivia Brooklands, and before going any further, yes, we did just say we. We have a, just slight aside, we have a rare medical condition, which means that our biology actually responds better for a reason we don't really understand when we use a plural pronoun rather than a singular. Right. So we will be using we to refer to ourselves throughout this. We have a background in internal communication going back to the sort of early 90s. We were one of the corporate brand management team at Zurich Insurance, and then went out on our own in 1996 and started working with internal communication teams in mainly sort of national blue chip companies, but also government bodies, and then internationally as well. We've worked with the likes of the European Central Bank, the Central Bank of the Philippines, the United Nations, and so on and so forth. And we've been spending the last 25 years really building more and more insights into internal communication practice. We were also one of the founding directors of the Institute of Internal Communication here in the UK.
Wonderful, wonderful. That's brilliant. And I know you are, a pioneer in some sense of the internal communications governance terminology. So if you could quickly describe or define what that means.
Okay, well, we started out actually using the term internal communication governance a couple of years ago, and then discovered that other people were using that term to talk about things like content management and so on. And we thought, I don't really feel like governance to us, but that ship's already sailed. We don't want to confuse people. So we then decided, well, okay, even though it's not ideal, we'll talk about IC leadership because it is about the way in which the internal communication function sort of leads the discipline. But then we found other people were using that term to talk about their own, senior management roles in internal communication. So, oh, great. Okay, we'll go back to governance, but this time we will talk specifically about IC practice governance, because that's really what we're talking about. And internal communication practice governance has, first of all, the potential to enable IC specialists to gain way more influence and career prospects, because it very much puts you at the heart of huge improvements in business performance. And to define it, it is effectively sort of establishing and supporting what we could call minimum hygiene standards of internal communication practice, initially among line managers, but eventually, who knows, among all employees. Now, we appreciate that. If you start talking about minimum hygiene practice standards, that doesn't sound very sexy or innovative, but as we keep talking, we hope that you'll sort of discover how it actually pans out. So would it be okay to just give you a quick sort of illustration of it to help people understand what we're talking about? Okay, so in effect, IC practice governance is the internal communication equivalent of what the finance teams have been doing for decades when it comes to supporting budget holders, because of course budget holders are usually line managers who are not specialists in finance. They're not qualified accountants, and yet they're perfectly capable of managing budgets to the standard their organization needs, which is something that the evidence suggests is not yet happening anything like as reliably when it comes to those managers' internal communication activities. So we thought, hang on a minute, how is it that the finance team are able to get budget holders who aren't specialists to do that part of their job really, really well, and yet when it comes to internal communication, we're still struggling? So that's where the essence of IC practice governance steps in. It's really about looking at four things that the finance team do to support budget holders, which maybe the IC team could do to support line managers when it comes to internal communication. So those four things are, firstly, they define what the standards of practice actually are, which the non-specialists need to meet. Now, of course, when it comes to finance, some of those standards are often kind of enshrined in law, but it's still down to the finance team to actually tell people, right, these are the standards we need to meet. The second thing they do is they provide the instructions on this is how to meet the standards, and well, not just how to meet them, but why it matters. And
Yeah.
so they may even go to the point of providing education or sourcing education, maybe e-learning, bringing it in from elsewhere, so that new budget holders actually learn this is how to do this part of your job properly. So that's the
Right.
second thing, providing the instructions in how and why. The third thing they do, of course, is they monitor how well the budget holders are doing what they're doing with their monthly or quarterly returns and whatever. So they actually know, are these people doing the job the way they need to be doing it? And the fourth thing they do, of course, is if someone's struggling, they may need to step in and provide additional handholding. So that's how the finance team managed to pull this off. And if you take out the terms finance team and budget holders and replace them with internal communication team and line managers, that in essence is what IC practice governance is.
Fantastic. That's a great way to describe it, and I can relate to it. But again, Rob, there's an ideal situation. So again, of having that IC practice governance. So is there, why? I mean, going back to the question of why does it really matter? I mean, isn't this a given in organizations?
You would think, couldn't you? I mean, in many ways, you could say it's always mattered and it should be a given in all organizations, but we need to look at the reality and say, well, is it happening? And is it happening to the extent that it could be? Is it actually a sort of a no-brainer, just as it is in when it comes to finance? Every organization does that. Does every organization do IC practice governance? Do any of them do it perhaps consistently or to the same standard? So it's kind of always mattered that line managers are able to communicate effectively, and yet the reality is that maybe they're not getting all the support that they could to do that. Right. But it is important that we think about why it matters, because it does mean, as people watching this may already have worked out, hang on a second, that's a heck of a lot more work. Where are we going to get the resources to do it? Right. Resources are something we will come on to, no doubt, as this conversation develops. However, even though it's something that has always mattered, it matters even more now because of two things that have happened recently. The first of which is the pandemic. Right. Now, that dramatic global dislocation that happened last spring, which resulted in an almost instantaneous shift to mass working from home. Now, interestingly, within weeks of the first lockdown in the UK, at least, a study conducted by an organization called the Gatehouse Group over here was showing that many line managers were feeling extremely vulnerable about their abilities as internal communicators. And there were two key reasons for that. Firstly, because their role as internal communicators was suddenly way more obviously important, as they had to manage their teams in a completely new situation, which was changing on a daily basis and sometimes several times a day for a while. And all the while, obviously, their team members were having to cope with a new and for some of them frightening situation. So that was one thing. But at the same time as that was going on, their need for support from the IC team just wasn't going to happen, because the internal communication specialists were often working 15, 16-hour days just to support the leadership team to cope with this ever-changing situation. So the thing that happened very obviously was the need for line managers to become more self-sufficient as internal communicators than they ever have been before. And with the change to what looks like being a permanent situation of hybrid working and so on, that change is kind of here to stay. So that need for self-sufficiency is far more heightened than it ever was. It was always there, but now it's kind of inescapable. The second thing that's changed is that we now have IC practice standards of, we could say, a sufficiently robust quality to actually enable internal communication teams to provide the necessary support. And that's a little bit different as well. So those are the two things that have happened recently. But if we go back to the broader question of why does it actually matter in any case, well, it could be said that what happened quite a while back, we put together a list of 10 common challenges that internal communicators face. Things like, being called in at the last minute by clients. You may recognize that, or taking briefs from people who don't really know how to brief you properly, or you produce something for them and then they go away and change it and mess it up, and all of these common things that happen. Now, what's interesting is that we put together that list in 1996.
Wow.
20,
Okay.
25 years ago, we put together that list, and it's still every bit as troublesome today. I mean, 25 years ago, email was just in its infancy. There was no such thing as intranet. Social media had never even been heard of. And yet those common challenges that were there 25 years ago are still as common today, which means that, as far as the internal communication function has come over that period, still many of the very, very basic things haven't been taken care of. And we're having to do the job against that background. And what
Got
that
it.
means is that, how people talk about a win-win
Yeah.
situation. Well, the current situation it isn't just a lose-lose situation. It's actually a lose-lose-lose-lose-lose, if you think about it, because the reality is, now, obviously, when you talk about win-lose, when it comes to internal communication, it's not black and white. Though the
Yeah.
winning and losing is very much on a sort of a continuum.
Right.
But of course, in the situation we're in at the moment, and that we've inherited from the people who came before us, so it's not about blaming anyone. It's just saying, this is our inherited situation, is one whereby if you're an internal communication specialist to start with, you're probably losing more than you need to, because you're having to deal with clients who don't know what they want, but they know it's what they want when they see it, or bringing you in too late, or all of those sorts of things. So you're losing as a result of that. The line managers are losing. Because they're not feeling as confident as they otherwise might about how well they're communicating. Some of them perhaps suffering from imposter syndrome, or sort of emperor's new clothes thing going on, no one being prepared to put their hand up, so I'm not sure quite how to do this, which means their reputations may be suffering in two ways. First of all, if they're not able to communicate well to their teams, maybe their teams aren't performing as well, so the line manager's reputations with their peers may not be as good as it could be. But also, if they're not communicating as well as they might with their own teams, then their reputation with their teams may not be as good as it could be. So they're losing for that reason. Obviously, the third group that are losing out are the teams themselves, because they're having to work perhaps without all the information they need, or it's not of a high enough quality. So the very thinking that they're having to do about their jobs, about what's being asked of them, may not be as clear, and they may not be feeling as confident as they otherwise might. So they might be making mistakes, misunderstandings, perhaps some people feeling stressed and going off sick, and or maybe throwing sickies because they just can't be bothered, or maybe just walking out the door, which means, if you put it all together, that the organization, the fourth group, the organization as a whole, is losing, because employees aren't being as productive as they could be, or they may be having to spend more money on overtime or on recruitment and training and so on and so forth, which means that operating costs are going up at the same time as the mistakes and so on, means that the reputation is going down. So that's going on. And then the fifth group, as if we hadn't got enough already, are, of course, the people on the receiving end of what the organization is doing, who may be getting lower quality products or services at potentially higher costs. So we've got that kind of lose situation as a result of ungoverned IC practices. And what we're saying is that maybe it would be possible, if you were to start governing those internal communication practices, you could actually start moving everybody from that lose much more towards winning a great deal more. Internal communication specialists working with more clued in clients and being brought in good time, line managers who are justifiably confident in how they're communicating, team members who are more justifiably confident in the raw thinking material they're using to actually do their jobs, more motivated, making fewer mistakes and so on, so their confidence is going up as well. The organization obviously getting a win out of having fewer mistakes and misunderstandings, lower operating costs and higher brand reputation, and finally, of course, the external stakeholders getting better quality and products and services at potentially lower cost. So that's why it matters.
No, I think that's a great way of articulating how it really adds up inside the organization, and you kind of nailed it on the head in terms of the realities within the organization. So I mean, I think you kind of alluded to my next question as to you were talking about the IC challenges, and some of it has really changed over decades. And what do you think ails the internal communication function and practitioners today? I mean, how should we be looking at that?
Well, of course, that's a fascinating question, because, of course, not everybody's in the same boat necessarily. Some IC functions are doing very well, and they have all the resources they need, whereas others aren't doing quite so well. And of course, we've painted a fairly bleak picture here, and some people may be saying, "Oh, come on, Rob, it's not as bad as all that." Well, relatively speaking, perhaps not. But you've got to remember that ungoverned IC practice is pretty much the norm. It's kind of universal. So when people are sort of saying how bad or good is it, well, against what standard are you making that evaluation? How much better could things be if we had IC practice governance? So when it comes to what's ailing internal communication specialists at present, I mean, that we could spend a week answering that question probably, but some of the biggies are probably going to be not enough budget, not enough time, and not enough influence. Those are the big three that people often talk about. And so those challenges that we put together are kind of illustrative of the fact that that is what's going on at present. So we feel that it's really important to stop kind of tinkering around at the edges, given that those challenges have been around for the last 25 years. If we don't change something, they will still be here in another 25 years. You know, what can we actually do to change that situation, to make sure that the internal communication functions do have enough time, enough budget, and enough influence to actually make things work the way they could and should, not just for their own benefit. It's not a selfish thing. This is to actually enable the organization. It's to enable that win-win-win-win-win situation to happen.
Got it. Brilliant. So Rob, in terms of, you've worked and with numerous clients, and what are some of the best IC practice governance examples that you can share? Is there something which you can talk about?
Well, interestingly, I mean, obviously that's an important thing. What are the practices that would need to be introduced in order to make IC practice governance work, or not necessarily be introduced, but sort of beefed up or made sure that they're actually working? And of course, part of the challenge is that the answer may be a bit surprising. If we talk in terms of best practices, we would say that actually there aren't any. That may seem weird, but the reason for saying there aren't any best practices is because best practice itself is perhaps part of the problem. And again, that may sound like a weird thing to say, but if we think about it, it's actually a term that we've inherited from the people who came before us, which has never really lived up to its sort of self-proclaimed promise, as it were. If you go online, you Google best practice, you can find plenty of very kind of thoughtful, learned articles shredding the very idea of best practice, because it turns out that, ironically, if you're trying to work out the best way of doing something, the very concept of best practice isn't actually the best way of thinking about the best way of doing things. It's kind of ironic in that respect. So, but what's also interesting is if you look at all those articles, and we've been through loads of them, they never really give viable alternatives, which is a bit of a cop-out, we think. So we actually have come up with what we think is a viable alternative. And it's something we call practices which are DFVP. And what that means is practices which are demonstrably fit for valid purposes. Okay, now we appreciate that's not a sexy acronym or anything. But it is critical to make internal communication practice governance work. We were saying a few minutes ago that finally there are standards which are robust enough, and we believe that DFVP is what makes it robust enough. So we have a little, just to help people get this, we have a little visual aid that we can to help people follow what we're talking about, because we thought this would be useful, because it's not an expression that people are going to be familiar with.
If you could move up the card a bit more, I mean, now it's on the frame a bit more back. Just more towards you. Yeah.
More towards me.
Towards back. Yeah, towards you. No, it's still not visible. A bit more higher. A bit more higher. Yeah, perfect. Yeah, perfect. Yeah,
excellent.
That's great.
Okay, cool. Right. Okay. Apologies. This is just we're trying to make life easier and making life more difficult for ourselves in the process. So the reason we need to sort of talk about this is that everything really hinges on having practices which are DFVP if IC practice governance is going to work. So what does it actually mean? It actually provides 4 key benefits over best practice. In fact, if you're an internal communication specialist, it provides 6 benefits. So let's just sort of get clear about what they are. First of all, if we work backwards through DFVP, we start with purposes. One of the things that DFVP requires is that you actually articulate explicitly what the purpose of a given thing is. Okay. So that's not to say that nobody ever defines what the purpose is when they're doing best practice, but it's not an explicit requirement. So it may not be done. And even if it is done, Sure, you and many of other people have come across, been in meetings when people have said, right, this is best practice, this is the latest best practice, but you never get told what the purpose of it is, which means you're
Right.
kind of having to take it on faith. You're kind of working blind, which is
Yeah.
hardly satisfactory. So that's one of the problems with not having a clear purpose, in that people can't challenge it. They can't tell, well, is this actually appropriate for my situation? So that's why we need to articulate the purpose and be absolutely explicit about it. So that's the purpose. Then once you've got the purpose, because we also need to define or to validate that purpose. So what
Yeah.
makes this purpose valid? Because you've been in this game long enough, Anissa, we're sure to have come across clients who will say things like, right, the purpose of this communication is to tell all the employees about the product launch. And you think, what? You think what's the purpose of telling them about the product launch? So we know from experience, it's
Yeah.
perfectly possible for people to use the term purpose without that purpose that they come up with actually being valid. So we need to
Right.
go through a process of validating that purpose, because if we do that, we might say, well, hang on a second. So you want to tell employees about the product launch, and we can, is that actually appropriate, or do we need to go further? And
Right.
so what we do with DFVP is we validate the purposes that we're articulating, and then the key piece is demonstrably demonstrating two things. First of all, what is it that makes this purpose valid? You say it's a valid purpose. Show us your workings out. Can we see what makes it valid? Now, of course,
Right.
not everybody's going to be interested. Most people
Yeah.
probably won't care, but there will be people who need to know, especially if, when it comes to IC practice governance, you're going to start telling line managers better ways of communicating. There's probably
Yeah.
going to be, or potentially, quite a bit of pushback from some people, not everybody, but some people are going to want to say, okay, you say I should be doing like this, prove it.
Mm.
So being able to demonstrate what makes the purpose valid is
Right.
critical, because
Got it.
otherwise you could have a situation where people are saying, okay, so we understand why it's appropriate to tell the sales team and the customer service team about the product launch. How is that valid for the people working in facilities management?
Yeah.
What's it got to do with it? So again, showing our workings out is critical for enabling people to say, okay, we get why this matters, we get what the purpose is, and also demonstrating what makes this way of doing it fit for that demonstrably valid purpose. So we
Got
have to
it.
do both of those. That way, the practices are, robust enough, and they should be, in principle, unarguable. So
Got it.
those are three of the main benefits of having DFVP, but there are three more. The fourth one is kind of the coup de grace in many ways, in that what it does is it enables you to back everybody into a really empowering corner.
Mm.
Because as soon as you start talking in terms of practices which are DFVP, you're creating a new paradigm in which
Mm.
only four possibilities become possible. Here's one we prepared earlier. So
Great.
if you can see this, because as soon as you start talking about DFVP practices, what you've got is you've created this paradigm in which the purpose is either going to be valid or invalid, and the
Mm.
practices are either going to be fit or unfit,
Got
which
it.
means that as soon as you start talking in this particular paradigm, you've created a
Mm.
situation in which internal communication practices are either going to be DFVP, or by default, they must be either demonstrably fit only or demonstrably unfit for valid purposes, demonstrably fit only for invalid purposes, or demonstrably unfit for invalid purposes. These are the only other three possibilities. How many
Right.
leadership teams are going to say, yeah, we definitely want to go for one of those three? They're not going to do it, are
Yeah.
they? So when it
Right.
comes to this whole issue of the influence that internal communication specialists can wield, if we
Mm.
start talking in terms of DFVP practice, this is a game changer. Now, again, we need to make sure, okay, let's check our workings out here and acknowledge that the world isn't really quite as black and white as this.
Mm.
It's not either valid or invalid. There can be different degrees potentially of validity, which is why you might be able to see a
Yeah.
little arrowhead here. These again are continuums, and likewise,
Yeah.
how fit or unfit are the practices. So yes, we need to acknowledge that that's the case. It's not completely black and white. However, the reality is that surely to goodness, we should be trying to make all our internal communication practices as DFVP as we can. This is surely the
Got
direction
it.
in which we should be trying to head. And does that make sense?
Absolutely. No, I think this is a great model, and I like the quadrant and how it plays out. It's visually easy to understand this. So
Well,
thanks for sharing.
well, a pleasure. But in fact, if we could go a little bit further and think this through, because we did say there are 4 benefits of DFVP practice in general, but if you're an IC specialist, there are 2 more. Because if we think about it, well, hang on a second, surely this shouldn't just apply to internal communication. Surely all business practices should be DFVP, shouldn't they? Yes, they should.
Yeah.
However, internal communication pervades every other business practice, which means if the internal communication practices aren't DFVP from the start, what are the chances anything else is going to be? Which then means as soon as people accept this model, internal communication goes to the front of the queue. You have to go first. So the idea of internal communication is further down the food chain. No, this puts you right at the top. You have to go first, otherwise nothing else is going to work as well as it could. And the final benefit that it delivers is that when you get to the front of the queue, there's something else rather groovy waiting for you, because we've been talking about practices, and we may have been, a lot of people may have been thinking about, the design of the procedures and people's skills in applying those procedures. However, there is something else that's required to make practices DFVP.
Right.
The mandate to use those practice designs and skills. So if you're going to have a DFVP mandate, that means it has to be permanent. No more having to sort of re-establish your mandate every time a new broom comes to town, which is very often what happens now, isn't it? And I was a new HR director or there's a new CEO, and we have to sort of start from scratch and build our mandate and build the trust and blah, blah, blah. This essentially makes it a permanent mandate, which again, in terms of the standing of internal communication inside an organization, essentially raises us up to sort of an equivalent level again to the finance team. Because let's face it, the finance team don't need to re-establish their mandate every time a new chief exec comes in, do they? No, it's there, it's permanent. And that's what this can do for internal communication as well. And we think that's probably a good thing, isn't it?
Absolutely. Great. So brilliant. I think that's very, very relevant. Thanks for sharing. You had something else to share, or is that?
Yeah, because that's the kind of the model. But the question now we can actually answer the question you asked us in the first place, which is what are the practices that need to be DFVP? And in essence, there are 2 parts to this, because there are the practices that we know the internal communication specialists need to have set up, and then there are the practices that the line managers would need to follow, which is sort of a subset of that. So in simple terms, there are 5 practices that we've identified as being necessary to make IC practice governance work. The first of these, language standards. Now, language standards, that's not just, a lot of people might say, oh, we've already got a style guide. Yeah, this is not just a style guide. This is more than a style guide, because if you think about it, that whole thing of when you're taking a brief from some clients, maybe they come up with a load of techno babble and corporate speak and so on. And if they're doing that when they're meeting with you, chances are they're probably doing it in meeting with their peers and with their teams, which means that the language standards need to apply not just to how people write, but how they speak as well, which is a broader discipline. And so again, this whole thing of people pushing back, saying, you're trying to dictate to me how I speak. Well, it's about reining in, just getting rid of the techno babble and the corporate speak and the stuff that confuses people. So to a certain extent, yes, but that's the kind of breadth that language standards need to go. The second thing that they're going to need, or that you're going to need, is obviously a DFVP briefing process. And this is where, when you're doing it as an IC specialist, that briefing process obviously needs to be up to the job. But when you're sharing it with others, then the line managers, how are they going about identifying what their IC needs are? So that's something that needs to be in place. The third thing is exclusively for the IC specialists, and it's the channel mix. Making sure people are actually able to access everything they need when they need it, and also able to feed back on it effectively in the moment, rather than think, oh, I can't feedback on this at the moment. I'll do it when I get back to, and then the moment's gone, they've forgotten it. So the feedback may not be as well as it could be. And that leads us on to feedback, which is actually of 2 types. The process for getting feedback on the outcomes from individual communications. So are people actually able to do what you want them to do? Are they willing to do what you want them to do? Are we getting feedback on that if there's something that's getting in the way? And is that timely? Can they actually let us know in good time? And is the quality of what they're telling us everything it needs to be? And then finally, there's the question of giving feedback on the IC system. How well are the language standards working? How well is the message calendar working? How well is the channel mix working? Are people actually able to give us feedback on all of that in a manner which is DFVP as well? So those are the five practices that we need to have in place when it comes to the IC specialists. And as far as the line managers are concerned, there are three. They need to follow the language standards. They need to do a self-briefing process, being able to identify what needs communicating to whom, when, and how in any given business situation they ever encounter, and how not to waste the time of people who don't need it, like those in facilities management, for example. And also they need to be able to give valid feedback, whether that's on the outcomes or on the IC system. So it's not a huge list, but just imagine what it'd be like if all line managers were able to do these three things in a way which is demonstrably fit for valid purposes.
Fantastic. This has been brilliant. So Rob, I think what you're also saying, I mean, it requires a lot of mindset to be changed and shifted. So again, what are your thoughts about that? Because I mean, obviously, a lot of organizations already have established ways of working. So how do you kind of get people to move the needle?
Okay, well, that's a critical question, and it's one of the reasons we were so pleased to be able to come and do this session with you to see if we can start getting the conversation going and start getting people talking about these concepts. So it becomes a bit like employee engagement was 20 years ago. Nobody was talking about employee engagement. It wasn't a thing. And so we're kind of in a similar situation to that now, which means that as far as mindsets are concerned, we think there are probably three groups of people whose mindsets need to shift. Firstly, obviously, internal communication specialists. So if we imagine that probably quite a lot of your viewers are going to be IC specialists. So if you are in you're in a team and you need to change your boss's mindset, or you are an IC manager and you want to change your team's mindset, or you're one of a number of teams across your organization and you need to get more people kind of thinking in these terms, one of the things we could suggest is, well, get them to watch this podcast. That would probably be a good starting point. So they are kind of on the same page. That's one thing you could do. Obviously, the nature of this, we're just responding to your questions, Anisu, which means that other people are probably going to have their own questions, and we're not doing a Q&A session here. So one of the things that we offer is a free workshop that people can go on our website and you can just book a free session, and we will walk you through everything, and you can have all your questions answered. You can book it for your team. We could do a one-to-one initially if that's what you'd like, and then you can involve your team to actually change their mindset as well. So that's a way in which we can handle that, walk people through the nuts and bolts, let them ask their questions, and help people to start getting their head around this concept. The second group, leaders. Well, a lot of what we've just said could apply to leaders as well. So it could be a case of getting business leaders to watch this podcast, or getting them in on that workshop, which comes with no obligation. There's no obligation to do anything afterwards. If you sort of think, yeah, not for us, that's fine, but something that leaders are almost certainly going to be asking as well. One of their questions is, okay, what's all this going to cost? Which is a perfectly fair thing to ask, just as they quite possibly asked years ago about employee engagement. So one of the things that we also offer is a free tool that you can download, which will enable you to just get some rough ballpark figures about the cost benefits of IC practice governance. And the way it works is by enabling you to essentially, we come at it from a risk management perspective. We actually look at it from the perspective of, okay, so what is it currently costing an organization to be working with ungoverned IC practices? And you can't measure all those costs because there are way too many of them. But what we can do is we can just measure the time that's currently being wasted by 5 activities related to internal communication. So this tool that we've put together, it's called Realize. And what enables you to do, the free version enables you to use your own expertise, your own experience to just work out, okay, roughly how much time do we imagine people are currently losing each week reading needless emails? How much time are they losing each month in meetings that's just kind of going round and round in circles, aren't actually producing any useful results? How much time are they losing searching for information online, because either the intranet isn't as well signposted as it could be, or the links are broken, or because someone has stuck something in the wrong place on a SharePoint, or because a load of stuff has been buried under irrelevant information on an enterprise social network, and all of those reasons that stop people from being able to get to what they need as quickly as they could. There's also the time some people may be spending agonizing over to what to write in their own communications, either because they haven't been briefed properly, or because they're having to work with that dodgy, incomplete, unclear information from their line manager. All those things that can actually hold them up from being able to communicate as well as they could and write as quickly as they could. And then finally, the rework, which could be of two types. It could be people doing something and then finding out that someone else has already done it. Why did no one tell us this has already been done? Or very often, the amount of time they're spending having to correct mistakes or misunderstandings, either their own or other people's, because again, they weren't working with all the information they need. People had left gaps in the information, and they're having to guess, or they weren't feeling as motivated they could, or maybe they were having to rush because of all the time they've lost on these other activities. So all of these mistakes and misunderstandings that need to be put right. Now, what we've discovered is that when people just put in some very, very conservative figures related to these five, that they're generally finding that they average is that employees are losing roughly about 200 working hours per employee per year. Even if you're really conservative with these numbers. Now, if you're working in an organization of, let's say, 5,000 employees, that's 1 million working hours a year. So if you want to change the leadership mindset, because we all know what gets measured gets managed. So if you just realize it, just the free download, just put in. And now if you want to take it further and say, okay, let's get some more robust numbers. Yes, we have got a paid for version you could use, but very often we're finding people are convinced, even with the sort of the rough and ready figures, are enough to sort of sell them on the idea that, goodness, we are losing so much time. And this doesn't take into account, of course, all those other costs, like the emotional costs, the reputational costs, and so on and so forth, the recruitment and retraining, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, all of those other costs. This is just the time lost through just five, not all of the activities, just these five activities. And it's finding that the numbers are so extraordinary that people tend to be kind of convinced by that. So that's something you can do for leaders. And then finally, sorry, we're doing a lot of talking. We do appreciate that. There's the line managers. How do we actually change their mindsets? And of course, this is the one where we need to sort of tread very carefully, because we know there's likely to be pushback. We know there's likely to be people who are sort of object. I mean, even when we were little, we probably got upset when people were telling us that we hadn't said something right, and we might get a bit distressed about it. How much more upset our line managers are going to be if you go about telling them you're not communicating properly? So very important the way we position this. It's not about doing things right or wrong. It's really about enabling them to get better results more quickly and more reliably from their teams, with less hassle, less effort on their part, with them having to do, we talk about the correcting mistakes and misunderstandings. How much time are they losing having to correct mistakes and misunderstandings from their team? So it's about helping make their life better as well, and enabling them perhaps to kind of switch off at the end of the day rather than having to have loads of stuff rumbling around inside them. So that's part of the story. But we also need to just sort of be upfront about the fact that, hey, you know what? Even if you are making mistakes, you're not as good at communicating as you might like to be, it's not your fault. It's no one's fault, because here's a little secret. Human beings are not born with an internal communication gene hardwired into their DNA, which means that the idea of expecting anybody to just instinctively know exactly how to identify what needs communicating to whom, when, and how in any given business situation they ever encounter without anyone ever teaching them is nonsense. It's absurd. It's a crazy situation, which we've all inherited this from the people who came before us. It's no one's fault. So no one's to blame for this. No one needs to feel defensive or bad about the fact that there may be ways in which we can all get better. So that's something else that we can do to help make it easier for people to accept this. And the third thing that can make it easier is the fact that if I see practice governance is going to work, it really needs to come from the top down. The leadership team need to go first for a number of reasons. Firstly, because obviously there's the biggest sort of bang for your buck in terms of the ROI is going to be the biggest with the more senior people. The better we can make their communicating, the better it's going to actually influence the people further down. So that's one reason. The second reason is that if the leadership team don't go first and people lower down are raising their game, they'll be able to see the flaws in what the leadership team are doing, which is going to hurt the leadership team's reputation. They're going to want to go first, almost certainly. And if they do, then the third thing that does is it removes the stigma from people lower down. It must be okay to do this because look, the chief exec has done it, the CFO has done it, therefore it must be okay. So that's really how we feel we can go about changing the mindsets across the piece.
Brilliant. So, Rob, as we wrap up, just wanted to ask you, what's your one or two pieces of advice in terms of how IC practitioners can get stronger and better with, practice governance?
Well, the first thing to say, that's again, if we go back to 20 years ago, we could, if you were to ask the question, how can people get better at social media? The answer would have been, well, it doesn't actually exist yet, so it's kind of hard to get better at something that isn't yet there. So what we need to do in some respects is to think about how can we actually help people to work out how to get started in this journey, or in fact, even before that, whether this is a journey they even want to get started on. So that means we need to be talking to the early adopters in the sphere, and we imagine that you may have quite a number of early adopters among your viewers. In fact, maybe they're your viewers precisely because they are early adopters. So if we can address early adopters, if this has got your kind of juices going, you sort of, oh yeah, this does look kind of interesting, but like to know more, then firstly, well, it's probably a case of booking one of those free sessions, booking one of those free workshops, which will enable us to kind of walk you through what's in it for you, what's in it for your leadership team, what's in it for the line managers and their teams, what would it actually involve, how can you make the business case, how can you actually introduce this, and you can ask as many questions as you like, and we will be happy to answer those questions for you, so you can then start having the conversation with other people. And as we said earlier, if you want, and we've run these sessions sometimes with just one person, because they want to say, hang on a second, do I actually want to put my neck on the line and introduce loads of people to this session without knowing myself what it's all about? So we're happy to actually run that session one-to-one with an individual so they can actually decide, do I want to invite other people? If so, who would it be appropriate to have in this session, and how can I sell it into them? So that is really how we would suggest people get started.
Fantastic. This has been brilliant, Rob. Thank you so much for taking the time to share your insights. I think this is a great model and it's a great approach. I'm sure there'll be a lot more takers and a lot of interest in trying to try this out on the ground. So thank you again for taking the time to do this.
Well, thank you very much for inviting us to actually to be able to share this, because we're really excited about making this happen.